What's up, theology nerds? This is Tripp, and you're listening to the Homebrewed Christianity podcast. This is the podcast where we like to bring you some audiological ingredients, tasty things, deep things, reflective things for you to brew your own faith. We aren't into that mass-produced, watered-down, light beer-type Christianity. We want a whole bunch of tasty homebrewed craft-style theologies. So today, you're going to be hearing from Alan Roxburgh, founder of the Missional Network. We talk about a couple of his recent books, Structured for Mission and Joining God, Remaking Church, Changing the World. And it is a great time, a great conversation. And I know a lot of people will really enjoy it because quite a few of you kept asking for him to come on the podcast. And now he's been on. So if you're saying to yourself, well, I know someone that should go on the podcast, then you should let me know. And if you do, then I try to reach out to them and get them to come on the podcast. So, there are some members of the Homebrewed Christianity community who asked repeatedly for Alan to come on the podcast, and they did. So if you want to send some recommendations, do that. If you want to be a member of the Homebrewed community, you could do that too. Go to homebrewedcommunity.com and you can join the community. You'll be a part of our secret Facebook group, and you'll be able to join in a whole host of extra audiological treats and engagements. We'll be able to chat back and forth on Facebook and connect with other theology nerds, and you'll be able to support this podcast, keeping it going, happening, producing, and delivering for all the peeps out there who want some tasty, tasty theology. In the near future, we're working on a whole new setup for the Homebrewed community, where there'll be an entirely different podcast stream. So you'll get twice the podcast episodes just for being a part of the community, supporting it each month. I'm real excited about that. You can become a member at homebrewedcommunity.com. And coming up this August and September, we have an introduction to theology class, like an on-ramp to being a theology nerd. A couple sessions. There'll be live video interactive sessions that I'll be teaching, then doing some Q&A and stuff. And if you're a member, you can join live and participate. You can also send your questions in advance, and then you can get it in video and audio afterwards for your continued audiological enjoyment. So, you can do that. Head to homebrewedcommunity.com. Before we hop into this podcast, the other thing I need to let everyone know, and this is exciting, is that the second book of 10 in the Homebrewed Christianity Guide series is out. The Homebrewed Christianity Guide to the End Times, Theology After You've Been Left Behind by Jeffrey C. Pugh is out, and it is available. So you can go wherever it is. You get awesome books. You can go to like Amazon, local bookstore, Barnes & Noble, and such, and get that book. You can get it for all your friends. If you are saying to yourself, Tripp, well, what's the best way for me to get it to help you out? Then you can get it right from Homebrewed Christianity. If you go to the website, homebrewedchristianity.com, you can click up there at the top for shopping, and you can get the book. It'll be sent to you. You can also get all 10 of the books, all 10 volumes. You can pre-order it. It'll be cheaper and you can get it everywhere. There's like over $100 worth of free goodies, like classes I did with Philip Clayton, Peter Rollins, and stuff like that you'll get when you pre-order the entire set. You'll get sent my book, The Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Jesus, and the Homebrewed Guide to the End right now because they're out. Then later in the year, you'll keep getting more. Like I just finished, everything's all wrapped up for the Homebrewed Guide to God. Everything you ever wanted to know about the Almighty. That's the subtitle. And then I'm in the middle of reading and editing the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Church History, subtitle Flaming Heretics and Heavy Drinkers. And I've been reading the tweets from Donna Bowman about the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Being Human. She's working on it. I'm excited that the Homebrewed Guide to Evil is in process with Helene Russell. So if you're interested in supporting the podcast, getting a stack of good books, go to homebrewedguides.com and you can get the series and know that you're like going to have those books arriving before the rest of the universe knows what's up. There you go. All right. This is Alan Roxburgh. We're talking about missional thingy-mabobs. It's a fun conversation. And if you're a minister and you're in a congregation, I really think you're going to enjoy this because he talks about a lot of the challenges to changing cultures, visions, missions, and stuff, and gives some sweet, solid advice. So, get the notepad out. It'll be a good thing. Good thing. All right? Peace. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and today we are going to have a conversation about two excellent texts. Alan Roxburgh's Joining God, Remaking Church, Changing the World, and Structured for Mission. So they both came out in the last year, and they're both tackling this crisis that the church is in, changing culture, the threats to institutions, the challenge of developing a new imagination. And one of the things you all should know about Alan, if you happen to have hidden really well on the internet and don't know who he is already, is that he's both a nerd, like a professor, a pastor, and has been a consultant working with religious groups in transition and things for over 30 years. So before we jump into the texts themselves, maybe you could let us in on your relationship to this larger conversation, right? There are parts of the church, and be it more evangelical to more progressive to the historic traditions to more charismatic traditions, liturgical ones, to fresh expressions all over the place. And there are certain questions that you address in both of these books that everyone is starting to ask in the last 20 years or so. But I think people are now getting good at asking the questions, but then scared to really wait long enough or wrestle with the questions long enough to get an answer. And for younger ministers and leaders in the church, how would you introduce them to this conversation around new shapes of a church and mission in our time?
I think, first of all, let me give a little description of my own journey. You're right. I was, for a long time, the pastor of a number of congregations, 3, not more than that, each of about 7 to 8 years. And then I taught seminary for numbers of years, and I've taught adjunct, and then worked with denominational systems, pretty much every one of them, at both national, mid-level, and local levels. So I'm coming out of that experience. And part of what I would say is that in terms of where I sit now, and you talked about missional, emergent, you could go down a whole list. My observation would be, in many ways, those lists are all adjectival modifiers of one thing called church. Mm-hmm. And that across all of these new ones and old ones, what they continue to demonstrate for me is this massive, uncritical preoccupation with the question of what does the church need to look like, what does the church need to be, and it's sort of like vendors on street corners saying, look at us, we got it right, we're the old with the tradition. Look at us, we're getting it right, we're the new with the groovy things. But each of them are still embedded in the same conversation, which is what I describe as ecclesiocentric. Mm-hmm. And that, for me, in terms of where I have journeyed, it is not that being part of communities of faith are unimportant, they're vitally important. It's that God is inviting us into fundamentally different questions. And the questions are more about where is God ahead of us and how do we join God? To put it facetiously, God's left the building and you're not going to find God there anymore. And so this is about a whole different journey that we're to be invited upon. So what I would say, particularly to younger clergy and others is that your experiments in making the church work or new or revitalized are fundamentally to miss the point. And that it's how you can become a part of a narrative conversation about how we enter and discover with our people what God's doing ahead of us. Mm-hmm. Am I getting at your question?
Oh, definitely, definitely. One of the things I thought about when I was looking at Structured for Mission is that there's a paradoxical problem to the church in that we can't even see a way out of our problem because the problem is just part of the way we see the world.
That's what I'm describing. That's what you would call the Wittgensteinian perspective. That is, it's the picture that's inside us all the time is church picture. And it's practically impossible to get outside of it. And therefore, whether we're new or progressive or old and traditional, we just keep rehearsing. It's like Groundhog Day. Mm-hmm. Same stuff all the time.
So earlier you just talked about God being ahead of us, and relatively recently, in the order of the podcast release, I don't know, but last time Brueggemann was on here a month ago or so, he used very similar language for the prophetic community today needs to be one that is responding to the God who addresses us, who's before us, and that the shift in our understanding of God takes God outside of the priestly cabinet that has ideologically enclosed God, and opens us up and the world and stuff to this other understanding of God. And in one sense, when you describe it, it's very clear right there in the biblical text. In the other sense, the glass is all of us, especially those who end up in leadership roles, were given in the church, are ones that miss that narrative, miss that insight. When was it for you that you realized that the problem wasn't a part of our church and our system and assumptions we needed tweaked or rejected, but we needed to rework the whole thing?
Yeah, that was not that long ago. It was probably 5 or 6 years ago. And it was part of quite a long journey. Because I was as enmeshed and embedded, even in this quote missional conversation, in how do we make the church work, and what does it look like to really get a clear sense of its identity. I was as enmeshed in that as anybody, and I don't know quite how to explain it, but it over a very short period of time, it just dawned on me I was totally inside the wrong conversation. Mm-hmm. And it was like moving from one planet to another. I don't know how else to explain it. So I'm not being very helpful in response to your question.
Well, no, I think it is helpful because a lot of people use the word change, but there's really multiple definitions of change, like, we need to change. And for some, what they mean by change is like change within the reality of the system that's already there. And what that does is it leads to repackaging our language or communication or switching stuff. But what we do is we call reality the world as experienced through our psychological delusions as a church, and they're linked, and since you mentioned Wittgenstein, to our linguistic formulations.
Exactly.
Which shape not only the language we use, but it shapes our desires. It shapes where we identify problems. It's like a fish in a dirty fish bowl that doesn't even know it's sitting in its own pee and poop, and that the problem isn't that they got dirt on their scales. It's that they should just clean. You need new water. Now, there's that other element of change I think you're grabbing is where the change needs to be at the level of the reality system itself. It's not about components and not just behaviors or managerial tactics or technological innovations. It's transforming our relational dynamic around the gospel, spirituality, and such. The whole different organism emerges or something like that.
It's a big part of it. And in the midst of this, and this comes to, let's play with the language of change a little bit. I think part of what makes this so hard for so many is that, and this is what I write about in one of these books, is that even when people go to seminary or whatever it happens to them, and they study the Bible and all of that, and they come and they say, we need a biblical perspective on. And when they use that language, very often they are so unaware that they're using, and I use these words deliberately, they're using Scripture in a functional rationalist way of how to get our method. And it's about justice, or it's about these other things. But the thing is, in the midst of all of that, for me, it is also the confession that in the midst of the fishbowl that's murky and full of our shit, that's where the Spirit of God is present. Mm-hmm. And therefore, in the midst of that, it's what are the practices in the midst of the ordinary and the everyday that give us an opportunity to awaken to places where God is present. So the change piece for me is, because I hear this from a lot of leaders, is like, it sounds like there's no hope. And my response is, holy crap, there's huge hope. Mm-hmm. But it's about God. It's not about our tactics. Anyway, let me stop.
Oh, no. That makes perfect sense. And one of the ways that you even talked about this, and I don't remember which book it is, but you talk about the difference between we don't need a new institution, we need a new imagination.
Correct. Yeah, because as I don't know whether you want to ask further than that or want me to comment.
Oh, no, just go for it. I was just throwing it out there.
No, I'll just go at it. Because, what I say in one of the books is institutions are neither good nor bad. They're not evil, they're not of the devil. They're actually normative, human, and natural forms of life. But what institutions do is embody the deep underlying narratives out of which we live. Mm-hmm. So one of the ways of getting at those narratives is to ask, why do we have the institutions that we do? Why do we form them the way we do? When I teach theology, I take people into cities and suburbs and I say, why do we build houses like this? Mm-hmm. What does this structuring of reality say about what we actually believe? So my point is, particularly to lots of people out there who are saying, get rid of the institution and all that, my point of saying to them is that that's a royal waste of time and it misses the point. How do you begin to understand the narratives that are shaping you in these institutions? Then you can ask different questions.
So one of the things that I think is helpful is the way you highlight even that different places and different structures and things shape us, or often we're unaware. And at the beginning of one of the books, you kind of contrast the cathedral, the high rise, and the suburb. And then you go on to talk about similar observations around the way we structure economy and family and these type of things. Can you let us into these kind of pre-theological awareness that we need to develop in order to do theology that doesn't just recycle these patterns?
Letting in depends on who the group is one's dwelling with. But one of the folk who framed this so beautifully, and nothing new about it, is Alistair McIntyre, mm-hmm. who uses the metaphor of a stage, and that we are all born onto a stage. And when we're born onto that stage, there are props, there are scenery, and the script. And so part of the invitation, particularly for those who are, quote, leaders in the church, and I hate that word, is to ask the question, how do I awaken to the stage on which I'm dwelling and that's shaping me. And you know what? There are all kinds of really easy ways to do that. It's not that complicated. I mean, let me give you some simple ways. Spend some time on the street that you live in, where, at least where I live, most of the people don't even know how to spell the word church. And don't go out onto the street in which you live with a sense of how am I going to get them to join me, but with a sense of how can I become the stranger who receives their hospitality, and how can I begin to listen to their stories and their narratives. That's the place where you begin to see your own. Mm-hmm. And so what we're talking about here are not hugely complex, esoteric, up-in-the-sky ideas. We're actually talking about learning again to discover grounded life. Now, some people wanted to say that it's incarnational. But in my view, the minute you use that word, you're already into a narrative that's not helpful. So how do we live a grounded life that listens to the stories of the other without needing to categorize them? And that's one of the simple ways in which you get to see your own story and narrative in ways you've never seen it before.
Mm-hmm. So when you're spending time as a consultant, especially with people who are the anxiety for power brokers in the church around this conversation is like way higher than most of the people they minister to, because most of the people you minister to are like, I know I loved and experienced God in some way connected to the Jesus thing, and this is where you're supposed to go to figure that out and work it and pass it along. When I feel like part of our hang-up is the way the system has locked through this anxiety and toxicity leaders' imaginations in a box. So when you're thinking of engaging and consulting with people whose livelihood, retirement plan, insurance, and all this kind of stuff assumes fidelity to keeping the dirt in the water, how do you begin those conversations in hopes that something more life-giving emerges?
Yeah, there's three or four things in terms of how you begin. One is that those folk need to know from you that you know and understand them and their system and their story, and that you don't come at that with judgment or condemnation or critique. Secondly, they need to have a trust for you, and trust moves in a whole pile of directions. Trust is he's not here to get me. He's not here to undermine me. He doesn't have a secret thing in his back pocket. He hasn't said I'm useless. But trust is also to be able to demonstrate the capacity to perform well in the things that people look to you toward. So there's those things are just prima facie things that are really critically important. The second thing I would say is that you're right. A lot of these denominational leaders have very, very high anxieties, and they feel caught in a many-headed system that they feel is demanding and sucking their time, and they don't know how to do anything else with it. But before I say anything else, let me just say that they are not unique and out there on their own. Mm-hmm. Let me, just for the sake of time, let's not forget that those of us raised in states, in nations like Canada or America, are just as enmeshed in complex systems narratives that are destructive as those running denominations. Mm-hmm. And those of us who, in whatever form, live in an economy called capitalism, whether it's neoliberalism or what, we're enmeshed. So all of us are there. And for me, that's one of the clues. It's not judging, it's not criticizing, but with those leaders, It's about how do I listen attentively enough to actually hear the stories that are shaping them underneath the performative statements that they're making to me. And those become the spaces where you engage. Mm-hmm. So let me stop and see if I'm being concrete enough to your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's really helpful. And I think even the first part is important because I know so many people who, in one sense, have intuitions and imaginative insights and things that could really make an impact, and they don't ever get heard because their frustration with the output of the system leads them to judge the very people that are in it. And then they end up talking past each other or rejecting each other when there's more hope in staying connected across those differences and as opposed to kind of demonizing the other and saying the problem is that thing over there.
Exactly. And I would take it further, is that more often than not always, the folk who've either got into leadership in these systems or the people who are critiquing them in the missional, emergent, progressive, whatever, they're often what I call romantic idealists.
Yes.
They are gifted at climbing the ladder of abstraction, and they are gifted at pointing the finger at the deficiencies of the other, and they're gifted at painting these idealistic pictures, and they don't have a frigging clue how to land their idealism and romanticism on the ground in the everyday life of ordinary people who put their pants on one leg at a time, mm-hmm. which is a definition of being useless. And what happens is that they either go into those systems or they poke at them from the outside with their idealism and their formulas for what missional looks like or emergent looks like or that looks like. And when people don't get their idealism, they then say, see, useless, they'll never get it, we're out of here.
Yeah, the way I've talked about it before is it's the battle between utopians and simplifiers, where the utopians are those who have this naive idealism. They see a solution where there is none, short of the eschaton, but they're still going to like point at it, carry it around, and accomplish nothing. And then the simplifiers, their anxiety leads them to actually not see a problem where there is one, and then you end up just pointing towards each other. You go, where's the problem? It's there. It's objectified. It's external to them. You put a label on them, and then you forget that we're all responsible for what we bring to every relational system. And the church right now, it's like we're having battles over where to put the label of the problem, then recognizing that the health of the church is about our relationships to each other. We're Christians by how we love one another, not how we label each other.
So for me, I agree with you. I'd use different language. Is that the only way we can know and experience is grounded in the local and the everyday, and there are those like my friend Paul Sparks in Seattle, in Tacoma, mm-hmm. who discovered that and dwell in the local and the everyday. And then there's a whole pile of others who like to fly at 30,000 feet with all their formulas and then critique bomb everybody else. But I think we're deeply into a time when it is the grounded life in the local that is going to give us a sense of where God is and what God is doing.
One of the things I really enjoyed about the Joining God, Remaking Church, Changing the World text is it was a very practical affront to this myth that runs through church leaders that if you just know why, the answer to the why question around a problem, that's like the necessary precondition for real change. And what it ends up doing is defeating the possibility of change because the why question is just a horrible one to ask.
It's a horrible one to ask. Absolutely horrible one to ask. Yeah.
And the book spends half the time on these exercises that the question's never why. It's like, what is the situation? Who is present? Where are we going? And those type of things, which are material, turning yourself, like, instead of having a Christianity where you stare up and then deepen in, you're looking out and you're looking down. And that type of transitioning leads to why questions being just kind of, they make us obsolete. They do.
Yeah, no, that's a very good way to put it.
And and if you're thinking about it, there's a in between, and you go to the website, there'll be links to both books there. But the Joining God book is, I don't know, what you think, 2/3 of it is the exercises, and you can work through them with a group of people that. Yeah, at least I found as a minister, when you have resources that you can use, it opens you up to actually be the minister through the process rather than the teacher.
Yeah, I get your distinction there, and that's part of what I was trying to do. Yeah, I like that.
So one of the questions that I think we could pause on is your description of our changing structures that are going on, and the relationship you see between changing structures and changing stories.
Explore that a bit more so I can get a clear sense of what we're up to here.
So when you're talking about the in Structured for Mission, the changing structures of our time, like economics, of changing or family and these type of things, and changing and how they even impact the church and stuff. The structures changing are often where we outsource our explanations to why something's not working or whatever. I mean, I've sat in church board meetings where they're clearly, no one in that church is responsible for anything negative that's happening. It's just we're victims of the situation we're in. Yeah. And I think oftentimes our description of the structures that we're enmeshed in, the ones that we can hold up and look at and examine critically and stuff, that is as important as the way we end up telling stories, because they're intimately connected in our imaginative process for thinking critically and faithfully about the faith.
Yeah, in the book about structures, I tell several key stories that get to this point, and I would really direct people to that. But one of them, if you remember, was the story of, I always get these two cities wrong, St. Paul, the Catholic side of St. Paul, Minneapolis. And I tell the story of how the structures of that city in the 80s, 90s were coming apart. And that the attempt was to come at that breaking apart with all the established default structural responses, state funding, national funding, put together a blue ribbon panel. Mm-hmm. And none of that got at the core underlying issues. And then a particular person comes along who had grown up in that community. And because he had been rooted in that community, so outsiders can't do this. Because he'd been rooted in that community and had embodied a sense of its history and what was going on, what he does is he paints a picture. And the picture is of the Mississippi at the turn of the city. And he begins to invite people into conversation about that picture. And it's out of those kinds of conversations. Now, this takes skill. Out of those conversations, a whole different set of practices of coming together to see what the underlying challenges are begin to emerge. And it's out of those practices that you discover new structures. That's the sort of thing that's going on. So similarly, and I see this all the time in denominational systems, people are picking up the language of networks and emergent and learning communities. But it's stunning to watch how they take all that language, and this is anxiety, and they turn it right back into top-down command and control, inside-out engagements. And in those cases, you do need outside people to help people to reflect on what they're doing, not bring answers, but reflect on what they're doing. Those are two examples, but I don't know whether they're getting at the question that you're asking.
Well, I mean, another way of getting at it, I think, is what are those unnoticed, unexamined, unchanging external factors that lock us in to unimaginative, death-dealing structures?
Well, I could give you one example. Very, very recently, I don't want to be any more concrete than that. I was talking to a team of people visiting different places. The team was comprised of clergy and execs. And one of the execs asked me a question of, describe what you're doing and how your practices have changed. The other exec, after I talked, immediately took what I had said and tried to reinterpret it so it fit into his boxes and his understanding. Now, what was doing that? What was doing that was fear and anxiety that unless he could fit things back into his boxes, he would not know as a leader what to do. And if you don't know as a leader what to do, why are you collecting the paycheck? And that's it freezes the system. Mm-hmm. And so part of what you have to do is, when you hear that, is step back and begin to find ways of helping that person relax. But in relaxing, do other things. Like, for example, my response to him in that situation was, well, my observation is this is what you've just done. And so you're asking questions so that I will fit into what you need. Now, do you want to talk about that? And he was able to. So those are some of the ways you do it. Other ways you do it are for example, I have, and this would not be new to you, a lot of people who listen. I have folk who now meet together for a meal in their local neighborhood community. And during that meal, they break bread, have communion, do Eucharist. And in the midst of the Eucharist, they tell stories around a question. Where have we been seeing God at work this week in our lives and in our community? Just that simple reshaping of the way we order and structure our coming together opens windows and eyes and worlds. And you don't have to then say to people, established churches are no good and useless. Mm-hmm. You introduce those simple things. Again, I don't know whether I'm answering your question or not.
Oh, yeah. And I worked with, early when I was really young, one of the first ministers I worked with, we used to say, the most important thing you can do as a minister is make sure everyone knows they have permission to be wrong and to change their mind. And when you're in a leadership position and you don't feel like you even have permission to have been wrong or to have changed your mind, then you become like the authority that keeps all the problems we create and recapitulate in our mind locked in. And what's odd, I think, for many people, especially post-Enlightenment, is how when we don't recognize that the location of so many of the problems is these habits of our imagination, then the solutions themselves seem illogical to us when we first encounter them.
Absolutely. Completely counterintuitive. So I say things to leaders such as, if you want if you want to see culture change going on to the extent that you try to lead culture change, there will be no culture change. The extent, and it's totally counterintuitive because everything they've been given is about that. But it's worse than that for me. I mean, this comes out of conversations I've had even this week, where good men and women who have honestly and faithfully gone off to seminary because the denomination told them that's what they got to do to get into the guild and have the pension. They're in the midst of congregations and literally they have no idea how to listen and to read the narratives of those congregations outside of doing liturgy and trying to come up with, quote, ministry and mission. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's deeply disturbing that these seminaries just keep producing people who, with the best of spirits and intentions, do not know how to read the narratives and the cultures of their people. Mm-hmm. Which is the very first thing you should do in terms of ability.
Yeah. And one of the things that might be helpful here is to like, where do you see in the scriptures places where this type of observation and imagination taking place?
Well, yeah. There's lots of places. You've got just some texts that we work on all the time. One of the texts we used to dwell in a whole lot is Moses in the desert with the burning bush. And you have this narrative of a man who's done this in the text, 40-odd years. So this quote, desert out there, it's very, very familiar territory. He's seen it all before. There's nothing new here. And then the text has this wonderful little line that says, and he stepped over beyond the wilderness. In other words, at one moment he steps out of all of the things that are taken for granted. And that's where he sees this very ordinary bush in a whole different way. So in that text, in that context, then I ask the question, what might it look, if I were a pastor today, what would it look like for me to invite some of my people to walk about in their neighborhood in ways that give them an opportunity to step out of what's obvious and taken for granted and see something new, and to ask the question, where might God's presence be burning in that new that you see? So that's one biblical example. Mm-hmm. Another that we use is Acts 16. And you get this wonderful text in which Paul is clearly, he's got a plan in his head. And he's comfortable with it. And it's about Asia. And it's not working. And remember, the text says they go there and the Spirit prevents them. And then they go somewhere else and the Spirit of Jesus prevents them. And you get all this stuff going on so that there's this sense in the text that the plans that they were designing were not working out. Their SWOT analysis and their strategic design was simply not working out. And then, so number one, in that text, I talk about that as being God is messing with us. So when things are not working the way we thought, what would it be like to ask, how might God be messing with us here? It's already gone on before. And then you remember he gets this dream. And the lovely thing about this text is that it is a man of Macedonia who calls them over into Europe. And remember, they go over immediately. They're obedient. And they end up in Philippi, right? I think it's Philippi. And they're looking for all the right places in which to do their shtick. And while the text doesn't say this, you get the sense that it's not working. And so they go outside the walls, by the stream. Now, if you know anything about biblical imagery, you know that whenever a stream turns up, or a well turns up, or water turns up, those are the places where people who feel outside of any power and control are found, and it's where God turns up, like Jesus with the woman at the well. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, who do they meet there? Women. And they meet there Lydia. And don't need to go on. But yeah, the biblical texts are full of this stuff. Absolutely full of it. I shouldn't say it that way, but you know what I mean. But it's our eyes, when our eyes are shaped to read Scripture from the perspective of what's the transferable principle that we can catch and take back, or if we read Scripture as the primitivist, that is, there's our pattern, how do we copy it? We miss the dynamic of the narrative that's going on. So anyway, there's some examples.
Well, I think the dynamic part of it is really important because it's like the church can be really aware of the facts and they just want to fix the facts of the situation. And in one sense, they're immutable until the story or the framing changes. And I think that's the challenge that your text kind of provokes, is that you need to tend to where the real issue is. Not point at the output and act as if you have the power to force. It's like one of those Play-Doh machines where you put it in the top and it smushes down and comes out looking like a star.
Exactly.
As long as you're shoving it down that hole, it comes out like a star.
It's the only way it can come out. Yeah. So I had a conversation with a pastor this morning, and he kept talking about how he discerns the gifts of the people in his congregation. And finally I said, stop. The moment you start using this gifts language, you're in, to use your illustration, that kind of technical machine-like world. And you're missing the dynamic of God's life and the Spirit's work in the stories of your people. Lay that stuff down. It's not what it's about. That's abusing the Scriptures in order to find some template that I can use to get it right.
I think a lot of people are like where it's like you started making chili and it tastes horrible, and you think the only appropriate thing to do is to keep adding spices and new ingredients and beans until it tastes good. And like the grace is when God shows up and just spits in the soup. And it's like, please just stop trying to make this taste. You're missing the point here.
You're missing the point. Yeah. Now, to be fair, and I don't know who's listening to this, but to be fair, what we're talking about is counterintuitive, is about imagination, and it's bloody hard to do by yourself. Mm-hmm. And one of the tragedies is that too many pastors and church leaders are by themselves. And my experience is that this is not a journey you can take and sustain by yourself. It needs partners who can walk with you together in this kind of journey.
Well, and like you mentioned earlier, so much of like the system or dynamic that we exist in is it's a co-constructed reality with everyone that's in part of our normal, and we aren't going to see it for what it is. So it takes, especially with church leaders, friendships for people to help us see it. Right? We could even listen to our conversation and be like, "Yeah, I'm glad Alan knows what's up," but it takes you and I having someone seeing us to point our normal out to us.
Totally. Yeah, Tripp, I think you're a great guy because you're using all the same words I use, and we're all on the same page. Yeah, it's that kind of thing. You constantly need others to press in to how you're framing and doing things.
So if someone's hearing this and wondering what kind of like what to do with it, or they're wanting to challenge it, how do you give a leader their first step, right? Because I feel like sometimes you can see, or you can intuit or feel this transformation or challenge that's on the other side of a hill, but we just never take the first step.
Yeah, what we do, I just tell you what we do. Mm-hmm. Some of those initial steps are the stuff I write. And in that writing, people do ask those questions, so that what we do is and I'm just going to use shorthand here, both face-to-face and in this kind of video way, we invite small numbers of leaders, pastors, execs, into some learning communities. And those learning communities are built around action learning. So it's not just discussion. It's directed toward it's directed toward a leader in their local context identifying a key challenge or opportunity that they have that they don't know how to address. And so in those learning communities, we provide the space and the forum for them to work at that together over a 3, 4, 5, 6 month period of time. And that's what we found to be the most effective, because it creates co-learning, and yet at the same time it gives them a framework within which to begin looking at, okay, how do I take something that I don't know how to do and test it a little bit and try it out and learn from it and learn from others how to move down this road in this. So that's one of the ways we do that.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I really, really enjoyed talking to you, and I just want to make sure you let everyone know where to go on the internet to, I mean, the books and everything will be linked up on the website.
Yeah,
if you're listening, if they're driving in their car, we hope they aren't using the phone and going to a website. So what's the web destinations?
I believe the web destination, two destinations. One is the Missional Network. Just Google Missional Network, the Missional Network, and you'll get us. The other is, if anybody want to get in touch with me, it's my email address, which is alanjroxburgh@gmail.com. Mm-hmm. Happy to connect and talk.
All right, and the last question, which I know you're like the person that's supposed to answer this, is what's your definition of missional in under 2 minutes?
It's easy. I don't use the word anymore. I don't think it's helpful. Let's move on.
Well, but you already own the URL. So
I know. You change it in under 2 minutes. It's really simple. Newbegin asked the question, what is a gospel engagement with Western cultures? That is the core of the missional journey. The way that journey has taken place is we got confused and thought Newbegin was asking, what kind of church do we need? That's not the question he was asking. And therefore, the core description rather than definition is this. How do we go on a journey together of discerning what God is up to out ahead of us in our neighborhoods and communities in order to join with God there?
Mm-hmm. Man, how's that? It's like you get paid to do this. Thank you so much for taking the time and talking and sharing. I really, really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to the next time we get to have a conversation, and maybe I'll see you when I'm in Vancouver.
You've got my email address, Tripp. Let me know. I'll take you to coffee and beer.
All right. I know how to do both of those.
Good man.
All right.
God's peace.
Peace.
This podcast is sponsored by Phillips Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a theological school that offers Christian education in service of intelligent, just, and compassionate religious and civic communities. They welcome students to a safe space for truth-seeking conversation about the Bible, Jesus, and faithful living. They have on-campus and distance learning options. Go check them out at www.wherefaithleads.com.